Tonight, on the season finale of Nation and Nation, the trial of two men accused of murdering two Alberta Métis hunters recalls the case of Gerald Stanley, and it's happening in an area with a powder keg climate of racism and tension, says one NDP MP.
The climate in the community and the climate in the area is one of very overt racism, and it's very tense in the communities.
A Northern Ontario First Nation has had its rights recognized for the first time since it was skipped over in Treaty 9 talks 117 years ago.
Beaver House ancestors have always known that we are a First Nation distinct community, and the research has since proven that.
And we look back at some of this year's memorable guests, from the former Attorney General to the current Governor General. Hello, I'm Brett Forster, and welcome to Nation to Nation. Blake Desjardins has wasted no time making his mark on the House of Commons. The NDP MP originally hails from Fishing Lake Métis settlement in eastern Alberta. He won the riding of Edmonton-Griesbach away from the Conservatives last year and is now well into his first parliamentary session. Most recently, he's been pressing big oil to hand over millions of unpaid tax dollars owed to communities in his region. Mr. Desjardins joins me to discuss this and more. Hello and welcome.
Tansei, Brett, and thanks so much for having me.
First, I'd like to begin with some big news out of the Alberta region where you're from. Two men accused of murdering two Métis hunters near Glendon are currently standing trial. Both have pleaded not guilty. How closely are you watching things?
Well, Brett, it's disturbing in many ways to see that what has been really a long and ongoing historical injustice to Indigenous people, whether it's on the ground like we've seen in this terrible case, or even in the courts where oftentimes victims are re-traumatized and even put on trial. And that's what we've seen as far back as our relatives in Saskatchewan, of course, with Colton Boucher, and even other cases before that for decades, this lack of injustice for Indigenous people, and also the weariness I think Indigenous people face when going to the court. We know, first and foremost, that these systems have long prejudiced Indigenous people. We don't have to go too far to know that. You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the Murdered and Missing Women and Girls Inquiry, both state very explicitly that our justice system needs reform. It's disproportionately incarcerating Indigenous people, and it's victimizing Indigenous people. And the question is, who's the justice system really working for? And so I'm looking at this case very closely and hoping to see some of the big issues that our justice system often falls into, the big pitfalls, which is victimizing the actual victims and putting them on trial rather than the people who are actually charged for murder. That's a big piece of it. And also looking at the stereotypes that are often brought into the court. You know, in this case in particular, we look at how the media in many ways is portrayed in the court of public opinion, these Métis hunters as in some ways being the perpetrators of violence, when in many ways that's not the case. What we're facing is the fact of two Métis relatives of ours who were shot dead, and that's a fact, and they should not be dead today. They were chased down by folks who thought they were thieves, along a stereotype that Indigenous people are still scared to go out into some fields, even to harvest traditional medicines of today. So it's impacting us, and it's impacting, I think, families across our province. And it's a kind of injustice that I think requires the federal government to act. The minister, the federal justice minister, I hope also takes a clear view of this case.
Let me jump in there. You mentioned something I wanted to follow up on, which is kind of the climate in which this is all happening. What is the dynamic like between non-Indigenous communities and Indigenous communities in that region of Alberta?
Oh, well, you know, I grew up in the Fishing Lake Métis settlement, and it's right near Bonnyville, right near the same area of where the two Métis hunters were found dead. And in my experience, and many of the relatives who I know experienced the very same, racism is alive and well. And what we're seeing, I think, is an exacerbation of that racism to overt violence. Vigilante justice in some ways, which has to be called out and has to be condemned because it's resulting in people dying. You know, my own experience, for example, when I was going to just high school, the school board voted to remove of that region all of the Indigenous children out of that school, including myself. We had to fight. I had to move outside of my community just to be able to catch the bus to go to school there. And so this is an attack on children that's in the education system. And so the climate in the community and the climate in the area is one of very overt racism, and it's very tense in the communities. And I think it's something that we require real participation by our elected officials in the region to actually address, because it's been going on way too long.
Now, the case has echoes of the trial of Gerald Stanley, who was acquitted in the fatal shooting of Colton Boushie, as you mentioned. How confident are you in the justice system's ability to reach a fair verdict here?
Oh, that's a great question, Brett. And I'm going to be paying very close attention to how the Crown prosecutor addresses what is really a tough situation when, as a matter of fact, the defense has put forward a self-defense plea, and that is one of the first parts of how the narrative in the court of public opinion actually addresses this issue and can get to the point where the jury is affected. And so, we have to really think about some really key aspects of how criminal trials operate in Canada. One, especially coming out of Gerald Stanley, was the jury. We have to really consider how the jury is appointed. It's supposed to be a jury of one's peers. If the bench is completely white, it's hard to demonstrate how that kind of justice and even aspects of racial systemic racism play into these verdicts.
Well, I'm sure we could talk about that for a lot longer, but I want to switch gears. You recently grilled the oil lobby on the outstanding tax money that companies owe to communities. Let's play a clip from committee.
The number from the president of the Rural Municipalities Association of Alberta said $253 million in unpaid taxes to rural communities in Alberta. These are communities that are predominantly Indigenous, and they need that money. They need to be able to pay for roads, for services, for basic things. But these companies are putting that debt, that unpaid tax burden on regular, everyday people.
So why is it such an issue to get these companies to pay their taxes?
Oh, Brett, this is something that I think is such a overt and glaring blemish in how fairness is to be looked at, economic fairness in our province. First, we have a legacy in the prairies of companies, in particular the Hudson's Bay Company, of extracting our resources at our cost of our labor, cost of our communities. We're taking the brunt of much of that disproportionate work. And it's also, as a matter of fact, our land, but we disproportionately do not benefit from these resources. And this has continued on in Canada's legacy. And today, the oil companies are doing the exact same thing. $253 million in unpaid taxes is completely unfair. If I didn't pay my taxes for a year, you can bet I'd be in prison. These companies, however, are the only people in the entire country that can say, you know what, I don't want to pay my taxes. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to tell you that I don't think these taxes are fair, and I'm just going to not pay them. This is the only jurisdiction that this happens, is when Indigenous communities and rural municipalities need to actually pay for basic things like clean water and roads. These companies have the audacity to say no. And so what I'm concerned about is the fact that these companies are also the biggest profit margin companies in our province. They make billions. Some of these companies, Suncor, $3.3 billion in profit, a majority of it going to shareholders. So individuals making huge profits at the cost of workers, at the cost of families, and the cost of communities that have to keep the water running, have to keep those roads open, have to keep schools going. So many programs are at risk. And at the end of the day, that $253 million doesn't just show up out of nowhere. It doesn't just come out of nowhere. It actually comes out of the workers who work for these companies. Well, they pay that tax disproportionately.
As you say, if the money is there and they are making money hand over fist, how do you get them to pay?
Well, there's a few mechanisms the government has to ensure that they actually pay. One of the during that same hearing, the company actually came back and stated that they believe that there should be a fair share model that is consulted with the municipalities and the government. But this fair share model should exist way prior to the fact that they're drilling, way before a tax model is even created. So that's problem number one. We need to actually get a fair share model instituted. The Rural Municipalities Association of Alberta has created some of these models, and that's where the number $253 million comes from. It's from historical models of payments of tax. So we can enforce, for example, the CRA, Canada's revenue agency, a very important tax collecting agency, which often picks on, old ladies who missed a year or a young person who defaulted on their student tax. We actually got to use our CRA to actually do the real work of finding the people like these oil companies who aren't actually paying their fair share.
Okay, Blake Desjardins is an NDP MP from Alberta. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks so much, Brett.
After a short break, I'll speak with the chief of Beaver House First Nation about that community's long struggle for recognition. Welcome back. A Northern Ontario First Nation is celebrating after receiving long-awaited and hard-earned recognition of its status as a First Nation. The Anishinaabe community, known as Beaver House, is located about 600 kilometers north of Ottawa, where, in 1905, area First Nations and the Canadian government agreed to Treaty 9. As with other numbered treaties, the Crown sought to obtain the rights to Indigenous lands and resources to open them for settlers. In exchange, First Nations received cash, protection of hunting rights, and several reserves, but Beaver House did not. Wayne Wabi is the community's chief. He joins me now to explain. Welcome to Nation to Nation.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So what does it mean for the community to finally have its existence acknowledged?
It's an absolute amazing opportunity for us to finally again receive that recognition that Beaver House First Nation ancestors and past leadership have always claimed that we've had these rights to our territory.
And how has this lack of recognition impacted the lives of community members over the years?
On many fronts. It's definitely provided or limited the membership's ability to exercise their rights, as well as obtain adequate housing and infrastructure within its territory, and have a full recognized reserve, which we'll be working towards with negotiations.
And can you talk a little bit about the background behind this struggle? Why wasn't Beaver House included in this treaty in the first place?
Back in 1905, 1906, Canada and the commissioners traveled well with the Hudson Bay's Company, and there was most of the First Nations in the area were recognized as such because of the name associated to the fort. The trade routes did not recognize Beaver House First Nation as a community where they established a fort for the most part, and we were unable to enter into treaty with the government because the commissioners were traveling the other routes to those forts.
And what was it like?
One of the many reasons.
What was it like for the First Nation having to live kind of in this forgotten space for almost 120 years now?
As the community of Beaver House has always been very humble, very peaceful, and very much in connection with their territory and their lands. We really wanted to and have always maintained good relations with our neighbors, but without the recognition of First Nation rights under the Constitution, we were unable to engage into some meaningful dialogue with industry and government to share in the resources that were being extracted from within the territory of Beaver House.
How did past governments respond when your First Nation started to raise this claim?
What I remember and what I've been exposed to is seeing that they recognize Beaver House as being an Aboriginal community. And Beaver House ancestors have always known that we are a First Nation distinct community, and the research has since proven that. So, fortunate for us, Minister Miller has granted us that recognition as of April 19, 2022.
And why do you think it took this long? What was the resistance preventing it from happening?
Not really 100% sure. What the resistance was. it's compounded matters. I think we talk about resources that are being extracted and the acknowledgement pieces of another territory, and I think that's probably one of the biggest factors. But I'm not sure. I can't speak on behalf of the government.
Well, now that you do have this recognition, how do you go about obtaining a land base?
There's a number of negotiation tables that have to be stricken as a result of this new acknowledgement. And with the province of Ontario in its election break right now, we will be anxiously waiting for those results to reestablish a connection and dialogue with the provincial government, who have to transfer back the crown land or some crown land to the federal government, and then which then transfers those crown lands back to the First Nation.
As I mentioned in my introductory comments, it's been more than a century since the treaty was made. That's a lot of time, a lot of lost opportunity, as you indicated. So what does a fair settlement look like to you?
I'm not even sure. I don't know, and I dare not venture into that conversation. I think that's why we have our support staff and our negotiators to kind of iron out that.
How can you quantify that, right?
Right. It's loss of all of the things that our ancestors, and I look back at my grandmother and grandfather who trapped and I learned from on the land, and how do I put a dollar figure onto their loss of use for so many years, and that's why I dare not really quantify or put a figure to that, because I don't know that it's really me to make that determination. But that's why we have negotiation processes and look at what those compensations look like.
And how hopeful are you about the prospects of negotiation? Because after all, land claims talks do not have a reputation for being exactly quick and easy.
No, and I agree that it is a long process. I feel that the parties that are at the table now are very much prepared to engage, and I think that's all we can really ask to ensure that we are at those tables and having meaningful discussion.
All right, well, I'll have to leave it there. Chief Wabi, thanks for your time.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
We have to take another break. We'll be back in just a few minutes. Welcome back. Because this is the final segment of this season's final show, we've decided to leave you with highlights from some of this year's memorable guests. For example, Jody Wilson-Raybould. The former Attorney General spoke to me about her book, Indian in the Cabinet, on our very first episode, and she pulled no punches when assessing the current state of Canadian politics.
Canadians saw fit to give Justin Trudeau a minority government, which I interpret as Canadians saying, and I think necessarily so, that parties, that the Prime Minister must work together. There must be cooperation across party lines to address the major issues facing our time. So we find ourselves in a place very similar to what we had before, but still facing the incredible challenges, whether it be on reconciliation, climate change, but also having, the divisive nature that we saw in the election still, be likely brought into this parliament, and that's dangerous or corrosive to our democracy and what we need, which is to work together on these major issues.
Much of 2021 and 2022 has been characterized by the painful searches for unmarked graves at former residential schools. I spoke with Del Riley, a former national chief and co-author of the Canadian Constitution, about what searches at the country's two oldest institutions might reveal. Riley spent years in the Mohawk Institute in southern Ontario and shared some of his experience.
Here's what happened in 1950. RCMP came to our house and said they wanted to take all the kids and put them in residential school. We had 8 kids. My father had spent time in residential school. He was one of my grandfather's 11 kids, and they all went to Shingwalk Residential School at 10 of 11. And now he was, they took his kids the same way they were purporting to take us. And he ended up taking 5 of the 8. But he, along with my dad's wife, were trying to fight them off to save us from going, but it didn't happen. And the other problem, when they did take me in, I had TB. So I was probably a biological weapon they were using, and they knew I had TB.
Another headline-grabbing issue has been Indigenous identity fraud, the peculiar phenomenon of people pretending to be Indigenous when they're not. I spoke to Native Studies professor Kim Tallbear about this. She explained why it seems to keep happening.
There is this special place for the Indian in the kind of North American national imagination. So the Indian takes on this important role historically. So people, if you go back several hundred years, you've got, the Boston Tea Party, you've got people dressing up like they're Indian in fraternal orders. You have this playing Indian for a long time in terms of dressing up and putting on costumes. What happens then as you get into the 20th century is you get people playing Indian in terms of cultural appropriation in the New Age movement. And then you get this eruption of the race shifter or the pretendian, to use a couple of different terms. But I think even though it looks like not that old of a phenomenon, it actually has roots going back several hundred years, which is about needing to belong to this place and needing to feel that one has a moral authority to belong to and possess this land. So I think there's this kind of nationalistic ideas behind this, but also on a much more pragmatic level, there are economic and career benefits and media benefits and leadership benefits to claiming these kinds of identities.
Then, of course, there's Governor General Mary Simon. As the country's first Indigenous person to hold that role, Simon has certainly been in the spotlight. Last winter, I had the chance to sit down with Simon to discuss her journey from a day school in subarctic Quebec to Rideau Hall in Ottawa.
And I went to federal day school from grade 1 to grade 6. That's the level of education they taught in those days in the federal day schools. And the instructions were all in English. And the policy, I guess, of the government and Canada was that we shouldn't speak our Indigenous languages. So we weren't allowed to speak our language in school or on school grounds, and we were punished if we were caught speaking that. So even outside of residential schools, this policy was implemented. So it was a difficult period of my life. I think that it taught me that things weren't always equal in Canada. Even as a child, I learned a lot of things about the relationship, and it has carried me through over the years, and it really does help me understand the work that I've been doing for the last 40-some years.
And that concludes this show and this season of Nation to Nation. However, we will be keeping the show going as a podcast to the end of June. So be sure to follow us wherever you get your podcasts or online at aptnnews.ca/Nation to Nation. I'm your host, Brett Forster. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back again this fall.